Hello friends, David Lightbringer here for day 2 of Week of the Dragon, and today we're gonna get a little bit metal. That's right, so I got my Tool shirt, got my metal jacket, not my full metal jacket. Although we are talking about war, there's a coherent joke in there somewhere. Anyways, folks, in A Storm of Swords, you remember that book, right? Sir Jorah Mormont is talking to Daenerys about the history of dragons, their lifespan, and so on. And he says this: "A dragon's natural span of days is many times as long as a man's, or so the songs would have us believe. But the dragons the Seven Kingdoms knew best were those of House Targaryen. They were bred for war, and in war they died. It is no easy thing to slay a dragon, but it can be done." Sir Jorah is talking about House of the Dragon, and I'm not really gonna wear this jacket for the whole video. Anyways, yes, Sir Jorah is talking about the Dance of the Dragons, which is the war that we'll see depicted on the show, adapted from Fire and Blood. That's the war that many of the Targaryen dragons died in. But we're not here to talk about that war today, because that would be spoiling the show, and we're not gonna do that. So instead, we're going to ask the question, what would the people of Westeros have known about dragon warfare at the time that House of the Dragon begins? We talked a little bit about dragon biology last week in a live stream you can find on my YouTube channel, but we'll answer that question today by reviewing the history of dragon warfare, both in Valyria and in Westeros. And though there isn't a terrible lot to go on, this video will give you a better idea of just what the Dragon Lords on House of the Dragon are actually implying when they threaten to become hostile. So thanks for clicking on the video. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because I'll be releasing House of the Dragon preview videos all week to get you ready for the D. Dragons, that is. Alright, so there are basically two kinds of dragon warfare that we're going to discuss today. When people fight dragons with dragons of their own, and when people try to fight dragons on their own. The short story of people fighting dragons without their own dragons is that it doesn't go very well. But the slightly longer story is that occasionally a few people have had some small amount of brief success. Alright, so the first wars that Valyria fought with their dragons were their wars against the Giscari. And we can assume that the Giscari were able to mount some level of resistance against Valyria, simply for the fact that it took 5 of these wars for Valyria to finally triumph in a lasting way. We don't know exactly what the Giscari anti-dragon battle tactics were. We know the Giscari were famous for using a phalanx infantry, but that wouldn't have been the secret to resisting the dragons. I mean, that would have been basically just lining up so they could be burned more easily. But we do know that the Valyrians sowed their fields with salt after burning all of their cities, so that was pretty much the end of that. The Valyrians' war against the Rhoynar is the war we know the most about. The Rhoynar were a very advanced and just generally lovely river-based civilization in eastern Essos, who lived alongside the expanding Valyrian freehold for some time before conflict eventually arose. The main thing to know is that the Rhoynar had powerful water magics. Their mages could essentially work with water in ways comparable to how the R'hllorys can work with fire, or to the ways that the others can work with ice even. The champion of the Rhoynar was a prince named Garren the Great, and this is from The World of Ice and Fire. At Voluntheres, Garren found himself facing 100,000 foes, 100 war elephants, and 3 dragon lords. Here too he prevailed, though at great cost. Thousands burned, but thousands more sheltered in the shallows of the water, whilst their wizards raised enormous waterspouts against the foes' dragons. Rhoynish archers brought down 2 of the dragons, whilst the 3rd fled, wounded. In the aftermath, Mother Rhoyne rose in rage to swallow Voluntheres. And just in case it's not clear, Voluntheres is the Valyrian city, so essentially the water mages flooded the Valyrian city after they were done kicking the dragons' asses with their water spouts. However, I think you can see where this is going. The next time the Valyrians showed up, they brought a little more than 3 dragons. In fact, it was supposedly 300. And here's how that went. Tens of thousands burned, whilst others rushed into the river, hoping that the embrace of Mother Rhoyne would offer them protection against dragon flame, only to drown in their mother's embrace. Some chroniclers insist that the fires burned so hot that the very waters of the river boiled and turned to steam. So overall, that's not bad. They brought down 2 dragons, they injured another, they used magic, they used archery, but That's about as well as anyone did against the Valyrians. Now, the surviving Rhoynar, under the leadership of the famous warrior queen Nymeria, fled Essos altogether and went on an exodus of sorts that would ultimately lead them to Westeros and integration with Dorne. You'll notice the 2 pages we've seen from a history book that Alicent is reading from depicts Nymeria's journey. And in case you didn't know, the voyage of Nymeria's 10,000 ships is actually in development at HBO as one of the potential successor shows, and probably the one that most people are the most excited about. Now, we don't expect to see any water wizards on House of the Dragon, but I will point out that water in general does kind of bum the dragons out. Barristan Selmy actually notes that they don't like the rain in A Dance with Dragons, if you recall. And we also saw one dragon fight during Aegon's conquest where weather did play a factor, and that was at the battle outside of Storm's End, known as the Last Storm. Meraxes was effectively grounded by the lashing rain there, but was still able to use her tail as a giant whip, in addition to her teeth and claws. And the end result is that still nobody could fuck with her. So yes, the dragons don't like the rain, and we will see inclement weather play a factor in a couple of the dragon fights in House of the Dragon. However, that still doesn't mean you want to have anything to do with fighting a dragon. Alright, so the most famous success that people without dragons have had fighting dragon lords is definitely the slaying of Meraxes in Dorne. That happened in the deep desert at a place called the Hellholt, and the Dornish used a scorpion, which is something like a ridiculously oversized crossbow, and seemed to have gotten a bit lucky by striking Meraxes in one of her eyes, which is in general the most vulnerable part of a dragon. Unless they have a smog-like hole in their armor, I guess, but that's not something George reused from Lord of the Rings, although he did reuse quite a bit of things from Lord of the Rings. Anyway, even though I just called that a lucky shot, trying to pierce a dragon's eye is actually a decent strategy as far as strategies for fighting dragons go. And that's true for 2 reasons. First, dragons are known to turn to face their foes by instinct, as opposed to fleeing from danger by instinct. And secondly, dragons do have to face you directly to blast you with their fires. So you're always going to have at least that brief moment to shoot your shot before being roasted. Now, we just read that Rhoynish archers were able to shoot down 2 dragons, and we don't know if archer actually refers to a crossbow there, or if that's some sort of giant compound bow, but they probably struck the dragons in the eye. And since Rhoynish influence had spread all through Dorne by this time, we do have to wonder if perhaps some of the Rhoynar's experience fighting the Valyrians came into play. It's kind of like a video game boss, you know, fighting him a few times, you get to know his fighting patterns, right? So maybe the Dornish knew a bit more about the dragon's flight patterns and tendencies. They knew to aim for the eye, they knew maybe when they'd have the right angle or the right moment to take their shot, all that kind of stuff. Now, the Rhoynar took cover in the river, but the Dornish, being, short of rivers for the most part, took advantage of their desert climate, implementing hit-and-run tactics, sort of playing a cat-and-mouse game, basically just abandoning their castles and hiding in the desert whenever the dragons came by. Now, there aren't as many hidey holes in the rest of Westeros, but there are some, so don't be surprised to see people taking cover underground when the dragons come. And once again, we're reminded of just how much the dragons serve the role of bomber jets and weapons of mass destruction in the story. The only other time the dragons have been killed, again, before the time of House of the Dragon, was in the Doom itself. Obviously, we don't expect to see Sir Criston Cole using volcanoes against Daemon and Caraxes. However, it is relevant to point out that fire actually can kill a dragon. The eyes are once again vulnerable, and though a dragon's scales are mostly impervious to fire and actually get harder over time, it is possible for a larger dragon to potentially roast a smaller dragon. For a dragon's fires also grow hotter over time, so the bigger dragons have hotter fire. Tooth and claw are more often the ways that dragons attempt to kill one another, but it's worth knowing that they aren't completely impervious to fire. So apart from the Doom, Rhoynish and Dornish archers, and Rhoynish water wizards, and those White Walker fog banks, of course, no one has come up with a good way to fight dragons. The most famous example of people not having a good way to fight dragons in Westeros is definitely the Field of Fire. The main takeaway here is that the lords of the Westerlands who gathered to oppose Aegon and his sisters that day had obviously never studied their Rhoynish history and did not see any problem with lining up on a huge flat plain of dry wheat fields to fight dragons. As the name of the battle suggests, the Targaryen conquerors turned that dry plain full of gallant knights into a literal field of fire. Over 4,000 burned to death, and thousands more suffered burns and injuries. That battle essentially ended any meaningful opposition to the Targaryens in Westeros outside of Dorne. After that, people just surrendered to them on sight, including, famously, Torrhen Stark, who gave up the crown of the King of the North, knelt to Aegon in submission, and rose as the Lord of Winterfell instead. He bore the nickname the King Who Knelt, but it's often pointed out that none of the swords that the Northmen yielded up to King Aegon were burnt or twisted, like all the ones that came from the Field of Fire and elsewhere. Bottom line, there's really just no point in fighting dragons with soldiers, for the most part. So now we come to the topic of dragon fighting dragon. That's what we really want to know about. In case you're curious if the Valyrian dragon lords ever fought one another, Fire and Blood does speak of old Valyria before the Doom, when Dragonlord contended with Dragonlord for supremacy. But unfortunately, we don't get to any more detail than that. One presumes that Dragonlord infighting would happen from time to time, but apparently it never got so out of control as to destabilize the Empire. Or perhaps that was part of what happened to lead to the Doom. In any case, we don't have any records of how the Valyrian Dragonlords fought one another, so all we can say is that it did happen and that it must have been terrible. Now, over in Westeros, prior to the dance, there is but one example of dragon being used against dragon. That was when Maegor the Cruel usurped his nephew, Aegon the Uncrowned, after the death of Aegon's father, King Aenys, who was also Maegor's older brother, and of course, the second king of Westeros. That led to a war, and eventually a dragon fight between Maegor's Balerion the Black Dread and Aegon's Quicksilver, who was a smaller dragon that hatched around the time that Aenys was born. And by the way, both King Aenys and his son Aegon the Uncrowned rode the same dragon, Quicksilver. Now, fighting Balerion the Black Dread never goes very well, as you can see from this artwork by Rudolf Hema and Doug Wheatley. Quicksilver, a quarter the size of Balerion, was no match for the older, fiercer dragon, and her pale white fireballs were engulfed and washed away in great gouts of black flame. Then the Black Dread fell upon her from above, his jaws closing round her neck as he ripped one wing from her body. Screaming and smoking, the young dragon plunged to earth, and Prince Aegon with her. Alright, so we can actually learn a fair amount from this passage, even though the fight is totally one-sided. For example, note the places where Balerion wounds Quicksilver, the wing and the neck. After the eyes, those are the next most vulnerable places on a dragon. Obviously, the wings are more delicate than its armor-plated body, and obviously a dragon is less dangerous if it can't fly, although again, it's still pretty dangerous to deal with on the ground. However, it is implied here that a dragon can be wounded or even killed from a long fall as well. So if you can injure the other dragon's wings in midair, you may have a victory. And by the way, a quick follow-up to that, since I wrote the script, Miguel Sapochnik in an interview mentioned that the older and larger dragons after a time can potentially be injured by a rough landing because they're just so massive and so heavy. Along the same lines, just as a fall can crush a dragon, another dragon's jaws can also crush the neck of a dragon, as we saw in the fight with Balerion and Quicksilver. That may seem obvious in retrospect, as does pointing out that the wings are more delicate than the body. But the point is that the dragons know this and will attempt to bite each other's necks and wings when engaged. So one other note on the battle, called the Battle Beneath the God's Eye, by the way. When Aegon and Quicksilver were defeated in the air, everyone saw it. It was up in the air, and Aegon's side immediately lost heart, and the tide of battle turned very quickly. So just remember that the dragons are not only the biggest weapons on the battlefield, but also effectively carry the kings and generals around on their backs, and thus serve as a symbolic role and high-value target in the battle. It's kind of like, forgive me for making a World War II comparison, but it's kind of like if Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler were flying bomber jets themselves in the war. If you could manage to shoot down one of those, then you'd win the war for your side, which I assume would not be Hitler's side. All right, finally we come to Harrenhal. That's right, I put my jacket back on. It's time to get full metal. Now, with a shout out of honorable mention to the Sept of Remembrance, which Maegor the Cruel used Balerion to burn down, with hundreds of members of the faith locked inside, we've got to talk about Harrenhal, because even though the Sept of Remembrance was an unbelievable atrocity, it could have been accomplished without dragons. Harrenhal, however, Aegon, mounted on Balerion, melted the largest castle that Westeros had ever seen by himself. And he forced the submission of his greatest rival, Black Harren, again by himself. Or at least we should say that he forced the submission of Black Harren's former allies after he and Balerion burned his entire family alive inside their great castle. And this after, earlier that same day, telling Black Harren to his face, by the time the sun sets, your line will end. The number of the beast! As the last light of the sun faded, Black Harren's men stared into the gathering darkness, clutching their spears and crossbows. When no dragon appeared, some may have thought that Aegon's threats had been hollow. But Aegon Targaryen took Balerion up high, through the clouds, up and up until the dragon was no bigger than a fly upon the moon. Only then did he descend, well inside the castle walls. On wings as black as pitch, Balerion plunged through the night, and when the great towers of Harrenhal appeared beneath him, the dragon roared his fury and bathed them in black fire, shot through with swirls of red. Stone does not burn, Harren had boasted, but his castle was not made of stone alone. Wood and wool, hemp and straw, bread and salted beef and grain, all took fire. Nor were Harren's iron men made of stone. Smoking, screaming, shrouded in flames, they ran across the yards and tumbled from the wall walks to die upon the ground below. And even stone will crack and melt if a fire is hot enough. The river lords outside the castle walls said later that the towers of Harrenhal glowed red against the night, like 5 great candles, and like candles, they began to twist and melt as runnels of molten stone ran down their sides. All right, so that is the fire behind the eyes of an angry dragon lord. The road that things could always go down if tensions aren't smoothed. After Harrenhal, people sometimes talked of dragon lords making such and such place another Harrenhal, which simply means that you can't hide from dragons in a castle. Castles were, of course, the thing that rich feudal lords relied upon to keep them safe from harm. But Aegon suddenly proved that castle walls mean nothing to a dragon lord. So that was disconcerting, to say the least. One final note. In this scene, Aegon and Balerion attack from the direction of the moon, which is symbolism talk, by the way, because dragons come from the moon, as everyone knows. And more importantly, when the sun is up, the dragons instinctively use it as a weapon. We saw this play out in Dany's A Storm of Swords chapters. You remember that book, right? Where Rhaegal and Viserion were playfully fighting with one another. Ah yes, the good old days. Dragons always preferred to attack from above, Dany had learned. Should either get between the other and the sun, he would fold his wings and dive screaming, and they would tumble from the sky locked together in a tangled, scaly ball, jaws snapping and tails lashing. The first time they had done it, she feared they meant to kill each other, but it was only sport. No sooner would they splash into the sea than they would break apart and rise again, shrieking and hissing, the salt water steaming off them as their wings clawed at the air. So there you go, there's a little happier quote to leave you with, but of course there's a point here too. Dragons will use the sun to blind their opponents whenever they can. Expect to see some of that in the House of the Dragon fights for sure. All right, folks, thanks for joining me today. I forgot to do my little the council's in session thing at the beginning, but you saw it, you know I'm cool, you know I've got the thing, I've probably made too much of it by now, but in any case, thanks so much for watching. I do have a whole bunch more videos coming this week, one every day, so please do make sure you're subscribed to the channel, leave a comment, and tell me what you think, and I will see you tomorrow with a video about how the Targaryens are lizard people. #facts, #lizard people.